There is something unsettling about realizing that a familiar object, something woven into the fabric of your daily life, has a past you were never meant to see. That was the feeling that settled over me the moment I found an old federal case file from 1911. Its pages brittle and its typewriter ink fading, but still legible enough to whisper truth no one bothered to pass down. Until that moment, Coca-Cola was nothing more than what it is to everyone. A cold drink, a symbol of comfort, a nostalgic echo of childhood summers, roadside diners, and American culture itself. A sweet, harmless pleasure, a constant. But as I unfolded those creased documents, a very different picture began to emerge. One shaped not by marketing jingles or iconic red labels, but by courtroom arguments, government warnings, and a quiet struggle over what this drink really contained. I want you to imagine something with me. Picture a glass bottle of Coke sitting on a table, the shape you know by heart, the sound of the cap being twisted off, the fizz rising like a tiny fireworks show. It feels innocent, right? Now imagine someone placing a century-old legal notice next to that bottle and whispering, "This was once considered dangerous enough to take to court." That is where this story truly begins, not in a factory or an advertisement, but in a federal courtroom where the United States government accused one of the country's most beloved products of being misbranded, harmful, and intentionally misleading. According to the documents filed in the case United States vs. 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola, federal agents seized entire shipments of the drink in 1909, claiming that the company was hiding the true nature of its ingredients. The government argued that the drink contained excessive caffeine, far more than consumers understood or had any way of knowing about. There were concerns that this caffeine, an addictive stimulant, was being used not for flavor, but to keep people drinking more, hooked without realizing it. This was not speculation. This was a federal case, a courtroom battle, a moment in history quietly filed away. And yet, that was not the only secret the brand carried into the 20th century. Before the caffeine trial, early formulas of the drink famously included cocaine, extracted from coca leaves. Newspapers at the time discussed the ingredient openly. Historians later confirmed that the company removed the cocaine around 1903. But what matters for this investigation is not the ingredient itself, it is the pattern. A pattern of adjusting formulas quietly, of shaping public perception through marketing rather than transparency, of allowing entire generations to believe a version of the drink's history that was cleaner, softer, and safer than the truth. As I read through old advertisements and company statements from the time, the contrast felt almost surreal. On one side, federal agents seizing barrels of the drink because of concerns about addictive substances. On the other, classy magazine ads calling it a refreshing tonic and a wholesome daily pleasure. It was not just a difference in wording, it was a difference in reality. And the more I dug, the more apparent it became that the public was meant to see only one of those realities. What struck me most deeply was not the caffeine, or the cocaine, or even the courtroom battle. It was the silence that followed, the way these events simply vanished from mainstream memory. How could a federal case against one of the world's most recognizable products disappear into obscurity? How many other controversies about ingredients, labor practices, environmental impact, or health concerns slipped through the cracks while the bright red label kept shining like a distraction? In that moment, the drink in my mind went from comfort to case study. And the question that echoed through my thoughts was painfully simple. What else were we never told? Because every generation that held that bottle in their hands trusted it, believed in it, passed it down to their children. Yet the documents in front of me, the legal warnings, the ingredient controversies, the historical accounts, suggested that the story we inherited was only one version, a curated version, a comforting version. This video is not about attacking a brand or telling you what to drink. It is an invitation to look at something familiar with new eyes, to sit with that uncomfortable feeling of, I did not know this, and follow it all the way down, through decades of decisions, lawsuits, reformulations, clever marketing, and quiet silences until a clearer picture emerges. Because whether you love Coke or have not touched it in years, what matters is this: there is a part of the story you were never shown. And today, the box is open to understand why the 1911 case mattered so much and why it vanished just as easily. You have to imagine the world Coca-Cola was born into. America in the late 1800s and early 1900s was a country obsessed with progress, speed, and the promise of modern life. Cities were growing fast, factories were appearing everywhere. People were moving from rural routines to crowded urban streets, and with that shift came a wave of new inventions, new foods, new medicines, and new habits that no one really understood yet. Most Americans had never known a world with mass-produced products. Brands, as we understand them today, were a brand new idea. And because everything felt new and exciting, trust came easily, maybe too easily. Imagine walking into a pharmacy in 1900. Behind the counter, you would not find neatly labeled products or regulated ingredients. You would find shelves of mysterious tonics, syrups, powders, and drinks that promised to cure everything from headaches to anxiety to exhaustion. Many contained alcohol, caffeine, opium, or cocaine, but most labels never mentioned any of it. People bought these products because they believed in the idea of science, the idea of progress, the idea that modern chemistry could fix the problems of daily life. It was a time when the line between medicine and marketing was almost invisible, and companies took full advantage of that ignorance. This was the world in which Coca-Cola first appeared, not as a soft drink, but as a medicinal tonic sold by pharmacists who trusted whatever the manufacturers claimed. There were no safety regulations, no ingredient lists, and no standardized testing. If a product tasted good and promised relief, people bought it. And because advertisements told Americans that these new formulas were healthy, energizing, or restorative, entire families embraced them without hesitation. It was common to drink something every day without having the slightest idea of what it actually contained. But everything started to change in the first years of the 1900s. Reports of dangerous medicines, poisoned foods, and mislabeled products began to appear in newspapers across the country. Investigations revealed meat packed with chemicals, canned goods contaminated with toxins, and tonics claiming miraculous cures that had no scientific basis at all. This growing distrust created pressure for reform, and in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act became federal law. For the first time, companies could be prosecuted for misbranding, for hiding ingredients, or for selling products that were not what they claimed to be. This new law terrified the booming food and beverage industry, not because most companies were trying to harm people intentionally, but because many had been operating in a grey area where secrecy and exaggeration were normal. Labeling something as a health drink without proving it was considered clever marketing, not deception. Reducing or increasing ingredients without telling anyone was considered part of the trade. And for a product like Coca-Cola, built on a formula that had already changed once before, and was now being sold more for taste than for medicine, the law represented a direct threat. If regulators asked too many questions, the entire business model could unravel. The government's new focus on caffeine was part of this shift. Scientists were beginning to study stimulants more seriously, and concern grew over how much caffeine Americans were unknowingly consuming in tonics, teas, chocolates, and drinks that never disclosed their contents. Journalists wrote articles questioning whether companies were using caffeine responsibly or simply using it to ensure people kept coming back for more. Many brands shrugged off the concern, but regulators wanted to know which products contained what, and in what quantities. That is why the case of 1911 did not appear out of nowhere. It was the result of years of tension building between a newly cautious government and a booming industry that relied on secrecy. It was also the result of a cultural shift where Americans began asking questions they had never asked before. What is really in my food? What am I actually drinking? Who decides what is safe? And why did companies refuse to disclose the simplest information? In this environment, federal agents seizing barrels of Coca-Cola was not an isolated incident. It was a symbol of something larger, something deeper. It was about the collision between trust and truth, between tradition and regulation, between a nostalgic drink and the uncomfortable realities hidden beneath it. And while the case would eventually fade into history, the questions it raised never truly disappeared. They were the first cracks in a foundation of comfort that millions had taken for granted. If the early 1900s were a time of trust, the 1911 case was the moment that trust cracked. When the federal government filed charges against the drink, they did not do it lightly. They did it because something about the product did not match the promises printed on the bottle. And the moment the case file was opened, it became clear why federal agents had stepped in. The product was being sold as a harmless refreshment, but inside those barrels was something far more potent, something the public was never warned about. The government's argument was surprisingly direct. They claimed that the drink contained excessive caffeine, an amount far higher than the average person would expect or understand. This was not a mild stimulant at the levels found in coffee or tea. It was a concentrated dose, strong enough that regulators believed it was being used intentionally to create dependence. And because the company advertised the drink as a safe, everyday pleasure, that caffeine level immediately raised suspicion. Was it flavor, or was it strategy? Court documents from the time describe how federal investigators seized shipments labeled simply as 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola. They opened the containers, took samples, and sent them to federal chemists who analyzed the contents. When the tests came back, the government saw a pattern that worried them. The caffeine level was not accidental. It was consistent. It was deliberate. And it was never mentioned anywhere consumers could see. What made the case even stronger for the government was the gap between the product's image and its reality. Advertisements presented the drink as uplifting, refreshing, even wholesome. But behind the scenes, regulators believed that the product was being engineered for effect, not transparency. They argued that consumers had no way of knowing how much caffeine they were drinking, and that children especially were consuming it without any warning at all. In a time when newspapers were full of stories about dangerous medicines and mislabeled foods, this gap between promise and reality was impossible for regulators to ignore. The courtroom battle that followed was tense and deeply symbolic. On one side, the government insisted that the product was misbranded, that the company was hiding the presence of a powerful stimulant, and that consumers deserved to know the truth. On the other side, the company argued that caffeine was a normal ingredient, that it was widely consumed in other products, and that there was nothing harmful about it when used responsibly. The question at the center of the trial was simple but explosive. Was the caffeine essential for flavor, or was it essential for profit? Scientists called to testify debated the effects of caffeine on the human body. Some argued that it could be harmful in large quantities, especially to young people. Others said the risks were exaggerated. But the heart of the case was not about toxicology. It was about honesty. The government claimed that the company had not disclosed the caffeine, had not labeled it properly, and had not warned consumers about it. Under the Pure Food and Drug Act, that was enough to qualify as misbranding. If a company sold something without telling the truth about what was inside, it had violated the law. But here is where the story takes a turn many people do not expect. After months of legal battles, motions, and arguments, the judge ultimately ruled in favor of the company. The government could not prove that the caffeine level made the product unsafe, and the court decided that the law did not require the company to label caffeine at all. The product was allowed to return to the market unchanged. Yet the victory came with a shadow. Even though the company won, the case exposed a truth that millions of consumers would never hear. The drink they trusted had been formulated in a way they did not understand. The government had raised concerns serious enough to seize entire shipments, but the public did not learn any of this. Newspapers moved on. The case faded, and the image of the brand remained clean, comforting, familiar. What makes the 1911 case so unsettling is not the final verdict. It is the fact that such a case existed at all. It revealed that the company's decisions were not always aligned with what the public believed. It showed that secrecy was not an accident, but a habit, something woven into the fabric of the brand from the beginning. And even though the company walked out of the courtroom victorious, The documents left behind told a different story. A story of withheld information, of carefully constructed marketing, of choices made behind closed doors that shaped the habits of an entire nation. When you read the full transcript of the trial, one feeling becomes impossible to ignore. It was not just the product on trial, it was the culture of trust itself. And by the time the case ended, something fundamental had changed. Regulators were more cautious, scientists were more skeptical, and the comforting myth of the drink, the myth that it was simply innocent refreshment, began to fracture. This was the first major crack in a story Americans thought they knew, and it would not be the last. Long before the drink became a symbol of comfort, long before its red label appeared in diners and gas stations across America, its formula contained something that would shock most modern consumers. This was not rumor or conspiracy. It was openly acknowledged at the time, printed in newspapers, discussed in pharmacies, and accepted as part of the product's identity. For years, the drink contained cocaine extracted from coca leaves, and the ingredient was not a secret. It was simply seen through the lens of a very different world, a world where the boundaries between medicine, chemistry, and entertainment were blurred beyond recognition. To understand how such an ingredient became part of an everyday drink, you have to imagine what cocaine represented during the late 1800s. It was not viewed as a dangerous narcotic. It was marketed as a wonder substance, something that could boost energy, sharpen focus, and elevate mood. Doctors prescribed it for everything from fatigue to depression. Pharmacies sold it without hesitation. Even scientific journals praised it as one of the most promising medical discoveries of the era. In this context, adding it to a tonic did not seem bold or reckless. It seemed innovative. But the real issue is not that cocaine was once seen as medicinal. The real issue is how quickly attitudes changed, and how quietly certain companies adapted. By the early 1900s, health experts were sounding alarms. Reports began describing cases of addiction, harmful side effects, and increasing public concern. Newspapers shifted from praise to warning, and as public opinion changed, something interesting happened. The ingredient disappeared from the formula, but it did not disappear from memory. Companies began distancing themselves from their own past, reshaping the story of the drink's origins into something cleaner, something easier to accept. By 1903, the cocaine had been removed from the recipe, replaced by a decoconized extract of coca leaves. But this transition was not accompanied by public statements or transparent explanations. There was no admission that the ingredient had caused concern, no acknowledgement that the shift reflected a change in scientific understanding. The formula changed quietly, almost silently, while advertisements kept promoting the drink as pure and wholesome. And over the decades that followed, the early formula became something the company preferred not to revisit. This silence created something more powerful than denial. It created an illusion. Generations grew up believing that the drink had always been the same, always harmless, always familiar. The idea that it had once contained a substance now considered dangerous felt impossible to reconcile with its modern image. So the history simply faded. Only historians, archivists, and curious investigators kept the memory alive. Meanwhile, the company polished its nostalgia, focusing on imagery of family, happiness, and celebration, as if the earliest chapters of its story had never existed. What makes this part of the history so important is not the ingredient itself. It is the pattern it reveals. The early formula shows how the company adapted to public perception, how it shifted its identity when necessary, and how certain facts were allowed to drift into obscurity. It shows that the story the public inherited was not the complete story. It was the comfortable version, and it raises a question that echoes through every controversy that followed. If one part of the story could be softened, reshaped, or forgotten, how many other parts could be too? When you place this chapter next to the events of 1911, the picture becomes clearer. A drink born in a time of secrecy and enthusiasm for untested chemistry. A company willing to adjust ingredients without explaining why. A public eager to trust what felt familiar. And a tension between transparency and image that would follow the brand for more than a century. The cocaine era is not a footnote. It is a reminder that the story we think we know was crafted carefully, repeatedly, and sometimes quietly, and that the comfort people felt holding the bottle was built on layers of history, some celebrated and some forgotten on purpose. When you step back and look at the early chapters of this story, the cocaine formula and the 1911 trial do not feel like isolated moments. They begin to look like the first signs of something larger, a subtle pattern that would stretch across decades. And the deeper you follow that pattern, the clearer it becomes that the company's most powerful tool was not chemistry, marketing, or even innovation. Its most powerful tool was silence, a silence carefully maintained across generations, a silence that allowed controversies to fade before the public ever noticed them. The first major pattern is the way the company responded to health concerns. Long after the cocaine was removed and the caffeine trial ended, new criticisms began to emerge. Scientists and doctors warned about the effects of excessive sugar consumption, linking it to health issues that people did not yet fully understand. As research continued to evolve, studies suggested connections to obesity, diabetes, and long-term addiction to sweetness. But instead of acknowledging these concerns publicly, the company focused on shaping the narrative. Advertisements emphasized happiness, youthfulness, and emotional comfort, while the scientific debates unfolded quietly in the background. Another pattern appeared in the company's global expansion. As the drink spread across countries and continents, so did accusations. Some communities reported environmental concerns related to water usage. Others raised questions about labor practices and the treatment of local workers. Reports emerged from activists, journalists, and international organizations, each pointing to issues that rarely reached mainstream American audiences. And once again, the response followed a familiar rhythm. Public image remained bright and polished, while the controversies were handled quietly, often through legal statements or brief denials that were easy to miss. Marketing played a crucial role in maintaining this illusion. From the mid-20th century onward, the brand perfected the art of associating itself with emotion rather than ingredients. Ads focused on joy, friendship, nostalgia, and togetherness. Commercials showed smiling families, celebrations, and moments of unity. The drink was no longer just a product. It became a symbol, a cultural object, something that felt too familiar to question. And that sense of familiarity made it easier for the public to overlook the growing list of criticisms that appeared in reports and articles over the decades. Some of the most striking investigations came from journalists who began connecting dots the public had never considered. Articles explored how the company influenced academic studies, funded research that aligned with its interests, or supported messaging that shifted blame away from sugary drinks and toward exercise or lifestyle choices. These efforts were subtle, carried out through partnerships, sponsorships, or carefully crafted public statements. And although none of these actions were illegal, they contributed to a larger atmosphere of confusion, where the truth about the drink's impact became harder to see clearly. What ties all these controversies together is not the severity of any single event. It is the consistency of the pattern, a pattern in which the company stayed quiet when questions arose, adjusted its messaging when concerns grew too loud, or redirected attention when needed. This pattern is not dramatic. It is not explosive. It is much more subtle. It works slowly, quietly, over decades, shaping public perception in ways most people never notice. By the time you combine the cocaine era, the caffeine trial, the health debates, the environmental concerns, the labor criticisms, and the marketing strategies, something becomes impossible to ignore. This is not a story about a single moment of deception. It is a story about how comfort can be engineered, how trust can be shaped, and how familiar objects can hide histories that were never meant to be connected. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. The question shifts from, what happened back then, to what else did we never hear about? And that question, simple as it seems, is where the final stage of this journey begins. Because the real impact of the story is not found in a courtroom or a formula. It is found in the moment the consumer realizes that the drink they thought they knew was only one version of the truth. There is a moment in every investigation when the pieces stop feeling scattered and begin to form a picture. Not a perfect one, not a complete one, but something clear enough that you cannot pretend you do not see it. When you look at the cocaine era, the caffeine trial, the quiet controversies, the shaping of public perception, and the decades of silence that followed, you begin to understand that this story was never really about a drink. It was about the way trust is built, and the way it can be shaped without anyone noticing. It was about how something familiar can carry a history that never appears on its label. The truth is that most consumers never ask where their comfort comes from. They do not ask who decided the ingredients, who wrote the advertisements, or who chose what information should be shared and what should be forgotten. They do not wonder how many decisions were made behind closed doors, or how many warnings were softened before reaching the public. People drink something because it feels good, tastes good, or reminds them of something warm and safe. And companies know that. They know that comfort can protect them more effectively than transparency ever could. But once you know the story behind that comfort, something changes. You begin to notice things you never noticed before. You see the way ingredients are described. You see how advertisements focus on emotion instead of information. You see how nostalgia becomes armor, how familiarity becomes a shield, and slowly, the object in your hand stops being a simple drink. It becomes a symbol of how easily trust can be shaped, and how rarely people question the stories they inherit. None of this means the drink is evil, or that every decision was made with bad intentions. Reality is more complex. Companies grow, cultures shift, science changes, and decisions are rarely simple. But complexity does not erase patterns. And the pattern here is impossible to ignore. A formula that changed quietly, a stimulant that was never labeled, a courtroom battle that disappeared from memory, a history softened until it felt harmless, controversies handled in silence, and a public that never realized how much it did not know. If you think about it, the most powerful part of this story is not the ingredient list, or the trial, or even the controversies. The most powerful part is the moment when the viewer realizes that comfort is not always innocent. Sometimes comfort is constructed. Sometimes comfort is engineered. Sometimes comfort is the result of stories shaped carefully over a century, repeated until they feel like truth simply because no one bothered to question them. This video is not telling you what to drink or what to believe. It is offering something different. Context, clarity, a way to look at everyday objects and ask, what is the story behind this? And once you start asking that question, the world begins to look different. Familiar objects suddenly carry weight. History feels closer. And the truth becomes harder to ignore. Because the real revelation is not about the past. It is about your vision. About the way your eyes adjust once you learn to look beyond the label, beyond the nostalgia, beyond the polished image. When the illusion fades, the details finally come into focus, and the drink that once represented comfort now tells a different story, one that belongs not to advertising, but to history. And once your eyes adjust, they do not go back. You carry that clarity with you. You notice more, you question more, you understand more, and somewhere inside, a quiet shift happens. The world looks a little less innocent, but a lot more honest. This is where this chapter ends. And it is where the next one begins. If you want to keep seeing the truth behind the familiar, subscribe to the channel. We have more documents, more forgotten cases, and more stories that were never meant to be seen. Your support keeps this archive alive.